I've always loved books. Today, I have 3 bookshelves that are all close to overflowing. Books on top of each other, books on top of the shelves, books here and there in the room. The joy of placing a newly finished book is lessened by the fact that the shelf looked better before you put it there. So I've bought a new 4th bookcase to sit along my current one in the hall. And that is also a great excuse to take everything out and start placing them from the beginning again. Some might find this tedious. For me, it's the highlight of the year. As a child, I remember more visits to the local library and bookstore than anything else, apart maybe from the supermarket or so. At the age of 10, I had read most of the famous 5 novels. I had gone through a big chunk of the children's section at the before-mentioned library. And I had a sizable collection, new and second-hand bought comic books that I read many times over. Donald Duck and Swedish Rune Andreasson's Bamse overfilled my shelves, but I think I enjoyed the quick wit of Garfield strips the most. And coming up was a manga hype that took Swedish 12-year-olds with a knack of reading by storm. Endless editions of Dragon Ball, One Piece, and my personal favorite Neon Genesis Evangelion soon filled my bedroom and emptied my piggy bank. I remember that the reading pace established for the required books we read in school, maybe a chapter or 2 a week, bored me a lot. And I enjoyed when we got to choose books on our own. From my small school's teeny tiny school library. I think I was in 3rd grade when I picked up Cynthia Voigt's Homecoming and found it to take forever to read. But I remember more the sense of pride and accomplishment when I did finish it. When people say they like books, I feel like they always say it gives them calm and maybe even meditation. That they feel so much more immersed in the story compared to watching a movie. And don't get me wrong, I agree with that too. But at least to me, books are more than that. The joy of holding a physical hardback in your hands, feeling it, sensing its story and the work that went into writing it. The smell of the book, the taste of it. Sorry, that might be going a bit too far. The cover art, the feel of sifting through the pages, getting a sense of how the chapters flow, how far apart the paragraphs are spaced, the size of the font, the margins, and the length of sentences. It's the feel of joy before starting a novel you've been waiting for, and the joy of finding a spot in the bookshelves for it when you finished it. People most often get impressed when you say that you read books regularly. I guess in a time when texts and videos and communication are being squeezed down to smaller and smaller format, when our attention span could be no longer than a few seconds if you believe the paradigm on YouTube and TikTok and even news outlets. I guess in a time like that, it is impressive to finish a book. For me, it's a habit though. A habit I find much more enjoyable than going to the gym or doing the laundry. Luckily, the dread of doing both those activities can be helped by headphones and a solid audiobook. I think that the first non-children's fiction I read was the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown in 2005 or so. I think it sold okay, you might have heard of it. That might not be the proudest read in my most prominent spot in my bookshelves today, but it sure got me hooked. Hooked enough to plow through the rest of the available Dan Brown bibliography. I think I read at most occasionally as a young teenager. I guess the attraction of movies and TV series and video games took a sizable share of my time. This was still a time when all of the above was distributed on a CD or DVD, and I had just gotten my first laptop with a CD player that made it go hot enough to fry an egg on the keyboard. I want to say here that girls and all of the closely attributed teenage amusements also took some of my time, but who are we kidding? So with the new bookcase no longer in pieces and in place, it's time to take out all the books and organize them somehow. For some reason, it always looks like a lot more when you take it out and put it on the table. And now of course comes the question of how to arrange them. You of course want to keep series together, but it can be problematic if you also want to go aesthetically pleasing, with color sorting. Authors where some of the books are in a series and some are not, are also a problem. Most often, I find that giving them a section of their own is the best. You can build ski slopes, or you can go random. Go uniform, or go crazy. And then it's the problem with decoration. How much should you have of it and where to put it? I like to make my decoration fit with the books on the shelves, but it most often creates way too much unbalance. There is also the real nerdy way, of course, and here I'm not even talking about arranging your fiction by author's last name, I mean the Dewey Decimal classification for your non-fiction. Glasses down on the tip of your nose and occasional shushing of people around you, and you've got yourself a library there. While I crack on to try and find the middle ground in all that, I should probably mention Stephen King here. I think I was 17 or so when I read It for the first time, and a few more of his novels after that. I think I was mainly drawn in by the intriguing cover art of this edition in Swedish, and the prospect of having read a novel with over 1300 pages. But the characters, how many there were of them, and how deeply I felt I got to know them, both as a child and how that reflected in them as adults. And the intriguing monsters, and how heavy the book strained my untrained wrists, all made me fall in love with it. When I had turned 20, something changed in my reading. I started keeping a log of all the books I read. I did it on my laptop and not on paper, but for the sake of cinematics, why not? And while studying at university and living alone for the first time, I found myself with a lot of free time that I, to a large part, put into reading. In 2016, I read 93 books, a record I have not been close to beating since. I read all the Harry Potter books during that year. I think they sold okay, you might have heard of them. It was a series I had sort of overlooked as a child, even though I was in the perfect demographics for growing up with them. I found myself intrigued by Svetlana Alexievich and the short meetings with hundreds of people in her essay-styled journalistic works, how she filtered so much history and culture through the eyes and words of everyday people across Eastern Europe. Alexievich was the first Nobel Prize laureate I grew really fond of, even though I had ventured into Alice Munro alongside a few Peace Prize recipients before that. At about the same time, I read Norwegian journalist Åsne Seierstad's One of Us, and has since then read many of her excellent expositions of war zones across the Middle East and more. Another book I want to mention in this genre is Haruki Murakami's Underground. Depicting witnesses' reports after the sarin gas attacks in the Tokyo metro in 1995. Murakami captures so much of the Japanese sense of duty and character in the aftermath of a disaster. Overall, Murakami is one of my very favorite authors, one that I try my best not to read too quickly. Even though some of his older works like Norwegian Wood remains one of the best books I've ever read, his more recent 1Q84 series and Killing Commendator also captured me greatly. And the same must be said about previously mentioned Stephen King, even though some of his earlier work like The Shining and Firestarter are among my absolute favorites. So are much newer 11/22/63 and The Institute. It feels almost rude to think about that your favorite authors might not have that many more active years ahead of themselves. But the thought of running out of new novels to read from them seems scary in a way. I try to read on average one book a week now, so around 50 a year. Some years I succeed, some years I don't. I can happily report that for 2021 I succeeded. I read more in English now than when I was younger, but still the majority is in my native Swedish. Even though I consider myself a sufficient reader in English, there will always be that by a few percent slower pace, and I am just impatient sometimes. My rule is that I should, if possible, read in the language it was originally written. So if it's a Swedish book, I'll read it in Swedish. If it's written by an American, I'll read it in English. And if it was written by a Japanese author, I might as well read it in Swedish. But looking out for it being translated directly from Japanese to Swedish and not via English. Don't want to make that lost in translation larger than it has to be. I try my best to read with great variety, but some categories are more to my liking than others. There should be no surprise that I read more social sciences and global development than natural sciences if you follow my channel. I am also drawn to political biographies. They never disappoint you if you like showing off with thick books on your shelves. I bought a 10-pack of these transparent stands to highlight a few specific books I grew fond of in recent years, or that I just really like the front cover on. You have to make out which is which on your own. During the last few years, I have started listening to more audiobooks than before. I haven't grown completely fond of it, and find it more difficult with fiction than with non-fiction, but I'm getting there. If nothing else, it can reduce that one drawback with sitting down and reading. Back pain and dad grunts when trying to stand up after a long session. I most often find myself buying the book physically afterwards anyway though. I guess that makes it hard to argue that I don't like showing off the books I've read to any visitors. I think I'm close to being finished with this project now. All books have found their place on the shelves by now, and it looks much less cramped than before. Now, there is room for new reads. I might change it up a bit after a while, when I figure out a better configuration on a specific spot. But overall, I am happy with how it looks. Now, all that remains to do is read on, so I sooner rather than later can go buy a 5th bookcase.